The rain fell in a cold, relentless sheet, washing the city in a slurry of neon and shadow. It was the kind of rain that seeped into the bones, a miserable, persistent chill that promised a deeper cold to come. In the narrow throat of an alleyway tucked between a shuttered laundromat and a brick-walled warehouse, a small figure was huddled against the damp concrete. The fabric of her tattered red sweater, a color that should have been defiant, was dark and heavy with water, clinging to her like a second, colder skin. Her name was Reina, and she was 21 years old. The city, which had once felt like a universe of possibilities, had shrunk to the dimensions of this grimy, forgotten space. The rhythmic throb behind her eye was a familiar drumbeat, a painful echo of the impact that had sent her sprawling from her own front door. Her father's roar, thick with whiskey, still rattled in her ears, a sound layered over the sharper, more contemptuous curses of her brother. They had cast her out into the liquid dark, their final act of ownership a series of kicks that had left her ribs screaming in protest. Now, she simply tried to make herself smaller, to conserve the fading warmth in her core as the storm beat down, each drop a tiny hammer against the bruised geography of her body. The world had become a smear of running light, and the percussive sound of water striking metal, a symphony of urban indifference. She didn't notice the car at first, a long, black sedan that moved with the silent, predatory grace of a shark gliding through murky water. It stopped at the mouth of the alley, its engine a barely perceptible hum beneath the deluge. A door opened and closed with a solid, expensive thud. A figure emerged, shielded by a wide black umbrella that seemed to absorb the ambient light, creating a perfect circle of deeper night around him. He was tall, dressed in a suit so impeccably tailored it seemed to repel the rain by sheer force of will. His name was Kong Minjun, and the city was not a universe of possibilities to him. It was a chessboard, and he knew the placement of every piece. He was not supposed to be here. This was a detour, an impulse driven by a flicker of movement he had caught in his periphery, a stain of red against the monochrome gloom. His driver, a silent monolith named Mr. Cho, remained in the car, his eyes fixed forward, trained to see nothing his employer did not wish him to see. Minjun walked into the alley, his polished leather shoes navigating the puddles with an unnatural neatness. He stopped several feet from Reina, a silent, imposing silhouette. He saw the tangled mass of her hair, the stark paleness of her knuckles where she clutched the sweater, the tremor that racked her frame. He saw the dark, ugly bruise blooming on her cheekbone, a violent marring of her skin. He felt nothing, or rather, he felt the familiar, cold stillness that preceded a decision. Pity was a useless emotion. Interest, however, was a tool. And something about the scene, the abject misery, the defiant splash of red, the sheer injustice of it, had sparked his interest. He stood there for a long moment, the rain drumming on his umbrella, a metronome counting down to a choice. He could turn and walk away, leaving her to the mercies of the storm and the city. Or he could intervene. The pieces on the board were already moving in his mind. Minjun lowered the umbrella slightly, allowing the dim light from the street to catch the sharp angles of his face. His expression was unreadable, a mask of calm neutrality that gave nothing away. Reina flinched when his shadow fell over her, her head snapping up. Her eyes, wide and luminous with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, fixed on him. She saw not a savior, but another threat, larger and more unpredictable than the ones she had just escaped. Men in suits who appeared in dark alleys at midnight were never the beginning of a good story. She tried to press herself further into the wall, a futile gesture that only sent a fresh wave of pain through her ribs. He did not speak. Instead, he made a small, deliberate gesture with his free hand, a subtle beckoning motion. It was not a command, but an invitation, freighted with an authority that was absolute. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of the rain. It was a negotiation conducted without words. Her desperation was a tangible thing in the air between them, a scent of damp wool and fear. His power was just as palpable, an aura of control and immense, contained force. He was waiting for her to understand the offer. It was simple, his world or this one. The car, warm and dry, or the alley, cold and wet. Survival, or the slow, miserable surrender to the elements. For Reina, The choice was no choice at all. The last vestiges of her pride were a luxury she could no longer afford. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, but her body was a traitor, broken and unwilling. And some deeper, more primal part of her recognized that this man, for all his unnerving stillness, was not the same kind of monster she had fled. His was a different species of danger, colder, more precise, and strangely less personal. With a groan that was half pain and half resignation, she began to move. Every muscle protested. Using the rough brick wall for support, she pushed herself into a crouch, then unsteadily to her feet. The world tilted violently, the alley spinning in a nauseating vortex of light and shadow. She swayed, her vision tunneling to a pinpoint of black. Before she could fall, he was there. He had closed the distance in 2 silent strides, his hand gripping her arm just above the elbow. His touch was not gentle, but it was firm and steady, an anchor in the dizzying storm inside her head. He smelled of rain, expensive cologne, and something else, something clean and metallic, like cold steel. He guided her out of the alley, his large umbrella shielding them both from the downpour. The short walk to the car felt like a journey across a continent. The black sedan loomed, a void waiting to swallow her. Mr. Cho, the driver, had already opened the rear door, his face as impassive as his employer's. Min-jun guided her inside, settling her onto the plush leather seat before getting in beside her. The door closed, and the world went silent. The roar of the rain was instantly muted, reduced to a soft, distant patter on the roof. The air inside was warm and dry, a shocking contrast to the biting cold she had endured for what felt like an eternity. The car pulled away from the curb with a smooth, silent surge of power, leaving the alley and its miseries behind. Raina stared out the window, watching the rain-streaked city lights slide past, feeling as if she had just stepped from one reality into another, far more complex and dangerous one. She sat perfectly still, not daring to lean back against the seat, her wet clothes forming a cold puddle around her. Min-jun did not look at her. He stared straight ahead, a statue carved from shadow and discipline, his presence filling the small space with a heavy, unspoken weight. The journey was a silent passage through the city's glittering, rain-slicked arteries. They ascended, leaving the grimy streets behind for the cleaner, more rarefied air of the financial district, where glass towers pierced the bruised belly of the night sky. The sedan finally glided into a private underground garage, the gate closing behind them with a quiet finality that felt like a seal being placed on a tomb or a sanctuary. Min-jun led her to a private elevator, the doors opening with a soft chime to reveal a cabin of polished steel and dark wood. He pressed the button for the penthouse, and they rose in a smooth, silent ascent that made Raina's stomach lurch. She felt utterly displaced, a stray animal brought into a sterile, controlled environment where she did not belong. The doors opened directly into a vast living space. The apartment was a testament to minimalist wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic, godlike view of the sprawling city below, a tapestry of light woven against the black fabric of the storm. The furniture was sparse, modern, and severe, black leather, chrome, and glass. There was no clutter, no personal touch, no sign that a human being with messy emotions actually lived here. An older woman with a severe bun and a starched gray uniform appeared, as if from nowhere. She bowed her head slightly toward Min-jun. "Mr. Kong," she said, her voice low and respectful. He inclined his head in return, his gaze still fixed forward. "Mrs. Park, please see to our guest. A room, clothes, and something warm to eat. A physician will be here in 20 minutes. He spoke with the detached efficiency of a man dictating a memo. He did not look at Raina as he gave the orders for her care. Mrs. Park's gaze fell upon Raina, and for a fleeting second, a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, or professional concern, crossed her otherwise impassive face. "Of course, sir. This way, please," she said, her tone softening almost imperceptibly as she addressed Raina. Raina followed her numbly, her wet shoes squeaking on the polished marble floor. She was led down a long, silent hallway to a guest room that was larger than the entire apartment she had once shared with her family. It was as impersonal as the living room, decorated in shades of gray and white, but the bed was enormous, piled high with crisp white linens that promised an impossible comfort. Clean, folded clothes were already laid out on a chair, a simple set of gray sweatpants and a soft black t-shirt. On a small table, a tray held a steaming bowl of soup and a glass of water. Mrs. Park gestured to the adjoining bathroom. "There is a shower. Please, make yourself comfortable." The doctor is discreet. With another small bow, she was gone, closing the door softly behind her. Left alone, Raina felt the full weight of the night crash down on her. She stood in the center of the silent, luxurious room, dripping onto the pristine rug, a piece of broken debris washed up on a foreign shore. She showered, the hot water stinging her bruises, but washing away the grime and the cold. She dressed in the soft, clean clothes. She ate the soup, the warmth spreading through her slowly, chasing away the deep-seated chill. An hour later, a quiet, professional doctor examined her, speaking in low, reassuring tones as he cleaned a cut on her forehead and wrapped her ribs. He gave her something for the pain before departing as silently as he had arrived. Finally, she crawled under the covers of the vast bed. She did not sleep. She lay awake, listening to the muffled sound of the distant storm, her mind racing. She was safe, warm, and fed. But she was also a prisoner in this beautiful, sterile cage, owned by the silent, formidable man who had plucked her from the gutter for reasons she could not begin to fathom. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean and a city that sparkled under a pale, watery sun. Raina awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of being completely rested, the pain in her body dulled to a distant ache by the medication. She sat up, the fine cotton sheets pooling around her, and looked around the room. In the daylight, it felt less like a cage and more like a high-end hotel suite. A fresh set of clothes, simple black trousers, and a cream-colored cashmere sweater had been placed on the chair while she slept. She dressed slowly, the unfamiliar softness of the fabric a strange comfort against her skin. When she finally found the courage to leave the room, she found the apartment was silent. The vast living space was flooded with morning light, the city spread out below like a map. Minjun was standing by the window, a cup of tea in his hand, looking out at his domain. He was dressed not in a suit, but in simple dark trousers and a gray knit shirt that did little to conceal the disciplined strength of his frame. He did not turn as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her every step. "Mrs. Park has left breakfast for you on the island," he said, his voice calm and even. His reflection in the glass was a stern, unmoving portrait. She walked to the large marble island in the center of the kitchen area. A place had been set for her with a plate of fruit, toast, and a small pot of tea. She sat, but did not eat. The silence between them was heavy, a physical presence in the room. He had saved her, sheltered her, and had her wounds tended to. Now came the accounting. He finally turned from the window, his dark eyes fixing on her. There was no warmth in them, only a cool, analytical curiosity. He moved to the island and sat on a stool opposite her, placing his cup down with a soft click. The distance between them felt immense. He observed her for a long moment, taking in the clean clothes, the fading bruise on her cheek, the way she held herself with a tense, guarded stillness. He had 1,000 questions, but he asked only one, his voice low and direct. "Who did that to you?" It was not a question born of sympathy. It was a request for data, a piece of information required to complete a puzzle that had captured his attention. Raina's throat tightened. The words were lodged there, sharp and painful. To say them out loud would be to give them a reality she had always tried to deny, to contain within the four walls of that house. She looked down at her hands, resting on the cold marble. She could lie. She could invent a story about a mugging, a random act of violence by a stranger. It would be easier. It would keep her shielded. But looking at the man opposite her, at the unblinking intensity of his gaze, she knew a lie would be pointless. He would see through it instantly. More than that, a lie felt like a betrayal of the strange, terrifying lifeline he had thrown her. He had not offered pity, and so she would not ask for it. She would give him the truth, raw and ugly. She took a slow, shuddering breath and met his eyes. Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse with unshed tears and remembered pain. "My father and my brother. They did that. The words hung in the air, small and sharp and devastating. She watched his face, waiting for the flicker of disgust, of judgment. But it never came. Instead, something else happened. He gave a single, sharp nod, an acknowledgement of the data received. He did not say, "I'm sorry," he did not offer words of comfort. Such platitudes were meaningless. The statement, "My father and my brother did that," was not an appeal for sympathy. It was an indictment. And, in his world, indictments were followed by sentencing. He stood, his movements economical and precise.
"Eat," he said.
It was not a suggestion. He turned and walked down the hallway toward what she assumed was his office, leaving her alone with the untouched breakfast and the weight of her confession. The moment the door closed behind him, he was already in motion. He picked up a dedicated, encrypted phone from his desk, a device used for only one purpose: issuing directives. He dialed a single number. The man who answered on the first ring was named Jae-wha, his most trusted lieutenant, a man who translated Min-jun's cold intentions into brutally efficient action. "Sir." Jae-wha's voice was flat, professional. "Two individuals," Min-jun began, his tone devoid of any emotion. He gave Raina's full name, which he had already acquired from the briefest of searches the night before. Her father, Robert, and her brother, Thomas. "Find them. I want a complete profile. Financials, associates, habits, debts. Everything. I want to know every sordid detail of their lives for the past 10 years. I want to know where they drink, who they owe, and what they fear. Be discreet." "The girl is not to know." "Understood, sir," Jae-wha replied. "How long do I have?" 48 hours, Min-jun stated, before ending the call. He sat at his desk, the city spread out before him, but he wasn't seeing it. He was processing the information. The girl, Raina, was not merely a victim of random circumstance. She was the product of a specific, sustained cruelty, a systemic failure. In his rigidly ordered mind, this was an imbalance, a deep crack in the ledger of cause and effect. His intervention in the alley was no longer an impulse. It was now the first step in a calculated equation. He had removed the variable Raina from a toxic environment. The next step was to address the environment itself. His reasons were not altruistic. He was not a hero, and he had no illusions about his own nature. He dealt in power, in control, in the quiet, ruthless application of force to achieve a desired outcome. The father and brother were a nuisance, a piece of ugly, chaotic grit in the otherwise smooth machinery of the world he inhabited. And their actions had, by chance, intersected with his path. That was their mistake. While his men began to quietly dismantle the lives of her abusers on paper, Min-jun maintained his distance from Raina. He created a vacuum of normalcy for her. Mrs. Park continued to provide meals. The apartment remained a silent, secure fortress. He would see her sometimes, a fleeting figure in the long hallway, or sitting by the window, staring down at the city with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. She was like a rare, wounded bird he had brought into his sterile aviary, and he was watching, waiting to see if its wings would heal. He was in no hurry. Time was a weapon he wielded with more skill than any other. And for Robert and Thomas, their time was now running out. In the days that followed, a strange, quiet rhythm established itself in the penthouse. It was a life lived in the spaces between words, in shared silences that were more communicative than any conversation. Raina began to heal, not just physically, but in the deeper, more fractured places inside her. The constant, thrumming anxiety that had been her lifelong companion began to recede, replaced by a tentative calm. The absence of shouting, of slammed doors, of the sour smell of stale beer, was a balm. She found herself observing Min-jun, studying him as if he were a complex piece of art. He was a man of intense discipline. He rose before the sun, his mornings dedicated to a rigorous routine of exercise and meditation she could sometimes hear as a soft thudding or a profound stillness from the other end of the apartment. He spent his days in his office, a room she never entered, the silent heart of his unseen empire. In the evenings, they would often eat together at the large dining table, a vast expanse of polished wood separating them. The meals, prepared by Mrs. Park before she departed for the night, were always exquisite and served in perfect silence. At first, it was unnerving. But Raina soon realized the silence was not empty. It was a space of mutual observation. She watched the way he held his chopsticks, the focused intensity with which he ate, as if every action were a deliberate, meaningful choice. He, in turn, would watch her, his gaze analytical, assessing her state, her recovery, the slow return of color to her face. She was no longer just the broken thing from the alley. She was becoming a person again, and he was cataloging the changes. One evening, while he was in his office, she allowed her curiosity to lead her into the main living area. She ran her hand over the cool leather of the sofa, the sharp edge of a glass table. The space was his personality made manifest, controlled, precise, and emotionally barren. But then she saw it. Tucked away on a low shelf beneath a stark, abstract sculpture was a small collection of books. They were out of place in the otherwise sterile environment. She knelt, her fingers tracing the spines. They were not business texts or financial journals. They were volumes of poetry. Neruda, Rilke, a collection of classic Korean seijo, the original text facing a graceful English translation. It was a crack in the facade, a glimpse of a soul hidden beneath the layers of discipline and control. She pulled out the book of seijo, its pages worn and soft at the edges. She opened it to a random page, her eyes falling on a verse about the loneliness of a winter moon. It was a small, intimate discovery, a secret she now shared with him without his knowledge. It changed her perception of him. The monster, the criminal, the cold-eyed benefactor. He was all of those things. But he was also a man who read poetry about the lonely moon. It made him infinitely more complex, and in a strange way, more human. Later that night, as they sat at dinner, the silence felt different. It was less a chasm and more a shared space. She looked at him, at the hard lines of his face, and imagined him reading those words, and for the first time, she did not feel fear. She felt a profound and unsettling sense of connection, a quiet understanding that they were both, in their own ways, profoundly alone. He looked up, catching her gaze, and for a fraction of a second, his expression softened. The black ice thawed, just for a moment. He knew she had found the books. He didn't have to ask. He simply knew, and he did not mind. The call came on the third day. Minjun was in his office, staring at the digital architecture of a new acquisition on his monitor when the encrypted phone buzzed. It was Jaehwa. "It's done, sir," the voice said, flat and final. "The profiles are complete." A secure file appeared on Minjun's screen. He opened it. It was a meticulous, brutal biography of 2 failed lives. Robert, Raina's father, a history of failed jobs, mounting gambling debts owed to a particularly unsavory loan shark, 2 DUIs, and a documented pattern of domestic disturbances that the local precinct had consistently ignored. Thomas, the brother, a petty delinquent who had graduated to small-time drug dealing, deeply in debt to his own supplier, with a reputation for casual violence. The report was a litany of weakness, cruelty, and pathetic rage. It was uglier than Minjun had anticipated. He read through the associates, the habits, the fears. Robert was terrified of the loan shark he owed. Thomas was terrified of his supplier. Their entire existence was a fragile construct of blustering anger built upon a foundation of fear. They projected their weakness onto the only person they could, Raina. Minjun closed the file. The equation was now complete. He knew the variables, the pressures, the breaking points. He knew exactly which levers to pull. He made 2 more calls, his instructions delivered in the same calm, dispassionate tone. The first was to the loan shark's superior, a man with whom Minjun had a long-standing, if cold, business arrangement. The second was to the leader of the syndicate that supplied Thomas. The conversations were brief, polite, and utterly chilling. He was not making threats. He was calling in markers, adjusting balances, and subtly shifting pressures. He explained in abstract terms that 2 minor liabilities, Robert and Thomas, had become an inconvenience. He made it clear that their continued existence in their current state was no longer acceptable. He suggested that the debts they owed should be called in immediately and with prejudice. He did not specify the method. He did not need to. In his world, such things were understood. A loan shark, given a green light from a higher power, would not be gentle in his collection methods. A drug syndicate, told one of its dealers was now a sanctioned target, would be ruthlessly efficient in making an example of him. He was not ordering their deaths. He was simply removing the thin veil of civility that had, until now, protected them. He was exposing them to the natural consequences of their own wretched lives, consequences that had been accelerated by his influence. After the calls were made, he deleted the file and shut down the terminal. He stood and walked back to the window, looking down at the city lights. Down there, in the grimy, forgotten corners of his kingdom, two small, violent men were about to discover that the world was a much colder and more unforgiving place than they had ever imagined. A debt was being paid. An imbalance was being corrected. He felt no satisfaction, no pleasure. He felt only the quiet, clean feeling of a ledger being balanced. When he joined Reina for dinner that evening, his demeanor was unchanged. He was as silent and controlled as ever. But Reina, who had grown attuned to the subtle currents of his presence, felt something different. There was a finality in the air, a sense of something having been concluded. He met her gaze across the table, and she saw it in his eyes, the calm after a distant, silent storm. He said nothing of what he had done. He simply asked, "Is this soup to your liking?" It was his way of closing the chapter, of turning the page. The past had been dealt with. Now, all that mattered was the future. A week passed. It was a week of profound and unnerving peace. Reina's bruises faded to pale yellow ghosts, and the ache in her ribs subsided. She moved through the penthouse with a growing sense of familiarity, the sterile luxury no longer feeling so alien. Yet, a quiet tension hummed beneath the surface. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that something had happened. She hadn't heard from her family, but that was not unusual. What was unusual was the complete and utter silence.
No angry voicemails, no threatening texts.
Nothing. It was a silence so absolute it felt like an ending. One evening, she found the courage to breach the unspoken contract between them. Minjun was reading in the living area, not one of the poetry books, but a dense financial report. The lamplight carved his face into sharp planes of light and shadow. Reina stood before him, her hands clasped together to stop them from trembling. He looked up, his eyes patient, waiting. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. It was not an accusation. It was a search for truth, a need to understand the nature of the debt she now owed. He did not feign ignorance. He placed a thin bookmark in his report and closed it, setting it aside. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time not as a victim or a project, but as an equal in this strange transaction. "I corrected an imbalance," he said, his voice a low murmur. The words were simple, yet they carried an immense weight. They were both a confession and a deflection. "What does that mean?" she pressed, needing more. She deserved more. He considered her for a moment, deciding what currency of truth she could handle. "Your father's creditors became insistent. As did your brother's business partners," he explained, his language clinical and detached. "They were weak men who built their lives on the fear of others. I simply introduced them to men who are much stronger and much less forgiving. They are no longer your concern." The implication was clear, and a cold dread washed over Reina, followed by a wave of something she could not name. It wasn't relief. It wasn't joy. It was a profound and terrible understanding. He had not saved her from her monsters. He had unleashed bigger monsters upon them. She had been living in a cage, and he had not opened the door. He had simply killed the zookeepers. She sank onto the sofa opposite him, the strength leaving her legs. She looked at this man, this calm, disciplined purveyor of violence, and saw the full, terrifying scope of his power. And she saw that he had wielded it for her. "Why?" she whispered. It was the only question left. "Why would you do that for me?" Minjun leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes holding hers. "You showed me your weakness," he said, his voice dropping to an almost intimate level. "But you did not try to hide it. You did not lie. You gave me the truth, even when you were terrified. That is a rare currency. It deserved a return on investment." In that moment, the power dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. She was no longer just the recipient of his charity. She was a catalyst. Her simple, painful honesty had set in motion the gears of his world. She was complicit, bound to him not by gratitude, but by a shared, dark act. He saw her resilience, her quiet strength, and he respected it more than any plea for help. She was no longer a wounded bird. She was a person who understood the cost of things. He let the weight of his explanation settle in the quiet room. He watched her process the information, the conflict warring in her eyes, the horror of his methods against the undeniable fact of her freedom. He had not offered her simple justice. He had given her a far more complicated and binding gift. He had given her a clean slate, written in the ink of other people's ruin. After a long silence, he stood and walked to the window, turning his back to her as he looked down upon the endless river of headlights flowing through the city's canyons. The moment of confrontation was over. Now came the proposition. "You have two choices," he said, his voice reflecting off the vast pane of glass. "The first is this. I will give you a substantial amount of money. Enough to start a new life anywhere you wish. A new name, a new identity. You can walk out that door and never see me again. The past will be erased. You will be free." He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. It was a generous offer, a clean break, but they both knew it was the lesser of the two. "Or," he continued, turning to face her again, his expression serious, "you can stay." Raina stared at him, her heart pounding. "Stay and do what?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "This apartment, this life, it's not mine." "It could be," he countered. "I have many business interests. Some are less public than others, but many are legitimate. Art galleries, restaurants, real estate holdings. They require oversight. They require a mind that is sharp, observant, and understands the value of truth." He took a step closer. "I have seen you watch the city.
I have seen you study the people in it.
You see things others miss. You have a resilience I have rarely encountered. That is a talent. I do not like to see talent wasted." It was not a declaration of love. It was not a romantic proposal. It was a job offer. It was an invitation to become a piece on his chessboard, not a pawn, but something more. A queen, perhaps. Powerful, but still bound to the rules of his game. He was offering her a purpose, a place in his world, built on the foundation of the terrible thing he had done for her. He was offering her power. "The choice is yours, Raina," he said, using her name for the first time since their dinner. "A simple life, or a complicated one." Raina looked from his unyielding face to the city sparkling beyond the window. The city that had, only weeks ago, tried to swallow her whole. He was offering her a key to it, a way to not just survive in it, but to command a small piece of it. The thought of leaving, of taking the money and running, was tempting. It was the safe, sensible option. It was the path back to a semblance of normalcy. But what was normal? Going back to a world where men like her father and brother existed, where weakness was preyed upon without consequence. The world he had shown her was colder, more ruthless, but it had a strange, brutal logic she was beginning to understand. Here, in this penthouse in his orbit, she was not a victim. She was something else, something valued. She thought of the poetry books, the crack in his armor. She thought of the quiet respect in his eyes when she had told him the truth. He was a monster, yes, but he was a monster who had aimed his power away from her, not at her. And in her broken world, that was the only kind of safety she had ever known. Staying meant embracing the darkness. It meant becoming complicit in his world of balanced ledgers and corrected imbalances. It meant trading a simple morality for a complex and dangerous power. But leaving felt like a betrayal, not of him, but of the strong, resilient person she was becoming in his presence. She had been forged in the fire of her family's cruelty, and he was now offering her a chance to wield that fire herself. She met his gaze, her decision solidifying. There was no going back. There was only forward, into this strange new reality he had built around her. "I'll stay," she said, her voice steady and clear. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of Minjun's mouth. It was not a smile of warmth, but of satisfaction. The final piece on the board had just been placed. The game was about to begin. The seasons turned. The pale, watery sun of autumn gave way to the sharp, crystalline light of winter. The city below the penthouse windows was dusted with snow, its sharp edges softened, its noise muffled. A quiet permanence had settled into the vast apartment, a shared existence that moved with the silent, synchronized grace of two celestial bodies locked in a slow, deliberate orbit. Reina was no longer a guest. She was a fixture, a presence that had subtly reshaped the sterile environment. A vase of fresh flowers now sat on the living room table. A book she was reading lay open on the arm of the sofa. Small, human touches in Minjun's ascetic world. He had been true to his word. He began to teach her, not with lectures, but through inclusion. She started by reviewing financial reports for one of his smaller, legitimate restaurants, her sharp eyes picking out discrepancies a seasoned accountant had missed. Minjun had simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her talent. Soon, she was managing the accounts for a boutique art gallery he owned in a fashionable district, a place that dealt in beautiful objects and quiet, high-stakes transactions. She learned the language of his world, the nuances of leverage, the importance of information, the art of the unspoken threat. She excelled. Her past had given her a unique ability to read people, to see the desperation or deceit behind their eyes. She was not corrupted by this new power. She simply learned to wield it with the same cool precision as her mentor. Their relationship remained undefined, a space of profound intimacy that existed outside the normal lexicon of love or romance. It was in the way he would leave a file on her desk with a single, underlined passage he wanted her to see. It was in the way she would make him a cup of the specific tea she knew he preferred when he worked late into the night. One evening, they stood together by the window, a rare moment of shared stillness, looking down at the snow-covered city. The world below seemed distant, a diorama of a life they no longer fully inhabited. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly, not needing to specify what she meant. He did not turn to look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Regret is a luxury," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It implies that a different choice would have yielded a better outcome." There was no better outcome, she understood. In their world, forged in violence and necessity, there was no room for second thoughts. There was only the cold, hard calculus of survival and advancement. He had saved her, and in doing so, he had bound her to him. She had accepted, and in doing so, she had found not just safety, but a strange and potent sense of self. They were two solitary, damaged souls who had found in each other a mirror, a partner, an anchor in a world that had tried to break them both. The future remained an unwritten page, a landscape of veiled threats and complex maneuvers. But as she stood beside him, the warmth of the apartment a shield against the winter cold, Reina no longer felt afraid. She felt ready. They were a team, a quiet alliance of two, and together, they were strong enough to face whatever storm the city chose to throw at them next. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a pristine, deceptive silence.